Now, there are as many different ways of creating characters, and please, as I go through this list, if you think of anything that's not on the list, feel free to type it into the chat box and share your ideas. But these are the ideas that I've found have worked. Draw inspiration from real life. There are people around you. I'm sure that you have family members who have interesting quirks. You have colleagues who have interesting quirks. Don't be afraid to steal those quirks. Don't be afraid to steal their lines or even their backstory. But one massive disclaimer: do not make them, don't steal their entire personality and put them on the page. Even though most people are so egotistical, they actually won't realize that the villain that you've crafted is based on them, because they don't see themselves as the villain. But do try to mix them up. So, for example, if your horrible boss in your story is based on your own boss, do try to mix it up and make them just different enough that nobody's going to go, oh, yeah, that's Mr. So-and-so, because you do not want to be getting into libel territory. So draw inspiration from real life. Take notes. Watch people in coffee shops and put those into. I still remember being on an airplane years ago, and I think it was a flight between London and Dubai, and there was this expat family, mother and two mothers, in fact, and their little bunch of beautiful children, all heading off to Dubai where their husbands were working. And I listened in on the conversation, and I think that the children were Dexter and Hugo and Ruby. And I just, those names, they just were so yummy, mummy kind of. It's amazing how those names just painted a picture. And I have to admit, I was quite fascinated by that family, those two mothers and their children, the whole way through the flight, thinking one day I am so going to write them into a novel. I haven't yet, but I do plan to one day. The next thing you can do is character questionnaires and interview your characters. Now, this is when I first started. This is how I started creating characters. I'm sure you've seen all those, and in fact, in the group coaching that we run, we do give you a character questionnaire that you can fill out to get to know your characters better. I have to admit, I've moved away from that a bit in my own writing. They're great when you're starting out. Some people do really like to know all the minutiae about their characters. However, I find these days I've moved more into that next point on the list. Know their goals, their motivations, wounds, and arcs. I no longer bother with what is their favorite breakfast cereal, what do they eat for breakfast, what time do they get up in the morning, because that kind of stuff actually comes to me as I'm writing the draft. So I don't really bother anymore with doing those detailed character questionnaires where I know absolutely everything about this character before I even write a word of the story. What I do instead is I make sure that I know what is it that they want in the story, what is driving them through the story. Why is, for example, in The Devil Wears Prada, why is she putting up with this job? Why in The Proposal is Margaret and Andrew entering into this fake marriage? Once you give them a strong enough goal to aim for, you've got something that's going to drive your story. But you need to motivate that as well. Why do they want this? Well, I love The Proposal because it really is such a clean-cut story, but Andrew wants to prove himself to his father. He wants to prove himself in his career, to prove that he can have a career that is not the one that his father has laid out for him, that he can be successful in it. So when he gets this carrot dangled in front of him of, I'll give you a promotion if you do this, into this fake marriage for me, he goes for it. Margaret, on the other hand, lost her family young. She has turned really hard, and she believes that her career is everything. So when she is threatened with losing her job because she's lost her work permit and she's about to be deported back to Canada, she enters into this fake marriage because her job really is her everything. But her motivation, so we know her goal is to keep her job, but her motivation is because her job has become everything, because she is afraid of getting close to people again and having a family. So she has invested everything into work. So that's basically the wound as well. Andrew's wound is his relationship with his father. Hers is losing her family at a young age. It doesn't always have to be that tragic. It depends on where your characters are coming from. But everybody needs to have, every main character, every protagonist and every antagonist must have a goal, a motivation, and preferably a wound, because the wound is tied into their motivation. And those three things will create their character arc. And quite frankly, if you've got that, you can write a story. Everything else sort of comes along the way. Give them a backstory. Whether this happens while you're writing, whether, I suggest you should know where they come from. I still remember seeing an interview years ago with Kevin Costner, who said that he really liked to select movies and scripts that were about a character that you just pick them up at a moment in their life and you follow them for a bit and then you drop out of their life again. And I guess if you look at movies like Dances with Wolves, that is kind of the kind of role he played. But for most of us, we want to feel like these characters actually came from somewhere, that they are. This is one way of making them a fully fleshed person. If you know how they were educated, do they have an education or not? What culture they grew up in? Are they rooted in tradition, or are they have they been drifters all their lives? The next thing is give them conflict to show who they really are. Now, this is going to happen as your story unfolds, but the kind of conflicts are going to develop them as characters. For example, Indiana Jones and his fear of snakes. Isn't it amazing how dumping him into this pit of snakes really shows us who he is as a person? Romancing the Stone, seeing, and I can't remember the character's name, but when she is lost in the jungle with the wrong attire and she loses her, her suitcase or whatever, her clothing, she loses everything of safety. Those challenges actually show us more about who she is and the challenges and what she's hanging on to in life than anything else can do. So work out what conflicts are going to work for these people you've created and give them the right kind of conflict that's going to challenge them. And then another thing I love to do is reverse casting. And this is what we're going to do in our exercise in a short while. Reverse casting is where you basically scour the internet for pictures. It could be actors, musicians, just random stock images. I find sometimes, that's saying a picture is worth 1,000 words. Just finding the right picture that shows you a personality, I find is a great starting place for creating a character. And in fact, I keep a folder on my computer. Just every time I see an interesting face online, I drop it into the folder so that I can use it as inspiration at a later date. Especially, characters, not just for your main lead characters, but for those interesting, quirky characters in the background. In my current work in progress, my heroine stops off every morning at a local bakery, and which is run by a brother and sister, and she stops in to chat. What did that brother and sister look like? What are their ages? It's amazing how just having a picture of that character will bring it immediately to mind, so that I'm not sitting scrabbling around now trying to figure out, is this a 20-year-old baker or a 40-year-old baker or a 60-year-old baker? Just once I find the right picture, I can keep that with me. And every time I write that character, I don't need to go into a big description of them, but because I've got them in my head, I know what they need to be in the scene. Right. And then there are people who don't do any planning and they discover who their characters are as they write the first draft. I guess these are pantsers. I personally like to be a little bit more organized than that, but I think you do find a lot of the magic while you're writing. You don't know what your character has for breakfast until you're actually writing a scene in which they're having breakfast and you go, is this out of the ordinary for them or is this usual? Sometimes it's those details, even their families. Sometimes I discover that they might only have a grandmother that they grew up very close to when I'm halfway through my manuscript and I suddenly realize that she needs some motivation for why she believes a certain thing, and maybe it was or has a certain hobby. Maybe she crochets or knits because it was something she used to do with her grandmother. So some of these things only happen as you're writing, and that's fine too. You don't have to plan everything up front.